We often think that happiness is about achieving new circumstances, right? I'm going to get a new job. I'm going to buy something. I'm going to get more money. And we assume that that's the right path to happiness. There's a real open question about, again, whether we've designed some of these things wrong. Thinking about a life with purpose and finding ways to achieve your values is really important.
So would you say to someone who feels broken because they can't be happy no matter how hard they try?
You're not going to go from 0 to 100 in 2 minutes, but there's simple behaviors, thought pattern changes, emotion regulation strategies you can use to move the needle a little bit. Sadness is often a sign that there's something wrong that we'll want to fix. But to fix it, you got to have the emotional bandwidth to do that.
A lot of times I feel guilty when I seek happiness. I'm not working hard enough. Why do I deserve this?
A good life isn't just the absence of all this bad stuff.
Regardless of whether you identify as a happy person or not, these tools are something that could really just help transform anyone's life.
One of the easiest paths to happiness is...
Welcome to Light Within. We are so excited you're here.
But before we dive in, we'd love to ask you for a quick favor. We're a brand new podcast, and your hitting subscribe would mean the world to us. So please take a moment to hit subscribe, like, comments, and help our team bring this amazing content to you every single week. Thank you. And now back to the episode.
Laurie, welcome to Light Within. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Thank you so much, Laurie. We're so excited to have you on because happiness is something we all think about, yet it is so fleeting. Honestly, most of us are so bad at achieving happiness. And you've devoted your life to figuring out the truth behind happiness and helping as many people as possible through your research. So I'm sure you have so much to teach us. We wanted to start off today with the question, why is happiness so hard for us to achieve?
I think the reason for that is just we have these misconceptions when it comes to happiness, right? I think we all want happiness. We're all kind of going about pursuing it. But I think we get it wrong, right? We often think that happiness is about achieving new circumstances, right? I'm going to get a new job. I'm going to buy something. I'm going to get more money. And we assume that that's the right path to happiness. But study after study shows that that's just not the case. For most of us, probably anyone who's listening right now who has the privilege of having, some sort of technology device that allows them to listen to podcasts, right? You're just not going to change your circumstances in a way that's going to make you happier. And that means that we're kind of going about it the wrong way. We get happiness wrong, and happiness is really hard to pursue because we don't go about it the right way. We're putting in lots of time and energy, but we're going after stuff that's just not going to work.
Why is it that so many of us get what happiness is wrong? Are we just wired to think in a different way? Yeah, it almost seems like, we should be wired to feel happy, but we're just not.
In terms of what we're wired for, it's probably not happiness. It would be nice if natural selection built our bodies to just be happy all the time, just sit around, experiencing Zen, right? But that's not what natural selection was going for. It was mostly trying to protect us from predators and trying to, strive to get as many resources and as much, copies of our genes in the next generation as possible. And none of that is helped by the emotion of satisfaction, joy, these kinds of things. If anything, it's helped by emotions like anxiety or striving or, overwhelm, right? Just putting too much on your plate. I think we're just not built to be happy creatures, or it's that's not what was kind of motivating all the design features that got stuck into the human brain and the human mind, right? I think in addition to that, we, with our human minds, design cultures and technologies that make some of this stuff even worse, right? We build phones that steal our attention and give us lots more of that anxiety-provoking information all the time. We build schedules that are just so overpacked, right? We build, whole structural systems that want us to get accolades and promotions and all this stuff. Again, a lot assuming that this is the way to go, that this will lead to a fulfilling life, a life well lived. And I think there's a real open question about, again, whether we've designed some of these things wrong.
What are the common ways that people are currently searching for happiness that is not working?
Yeah, well, a big one is money, right? If I could just be rich, I would be happier, right? This is why lots of people play the lottery. My Powerball, every time I walk by a little corner store and I see a little Powerball ticker, it goes up and up and up, right? And then people are putting more money into this. Again, and money, I think, is a tricky one, right? If you don't have any money, if you don't have enough money to put food on the table, if you can't put a roof over your head, yes, for sure, getting more money will make you happier. But for most of us, for many of the privileged people listening to this right now, the more money is just like really not going to work in the way you think. Or the opportunity cost of putting all your time and energy into striving for money, all that time and energy could be much better spent doing something else, making social connections, meditating, taking a breath, right? All of these things will probably work better than, getting that next raise, that next paycheck. So I think money is a huge one. I think another one is sort of just keeping up with the Joneses, right? We look out on social media and see what the people around us have, and we think, well, I need that car. I need that new house. I need that renovation on my kitchen. I need that next vacation. And we assume that those things will make us feel happier when so much of the work suggests that material possessions just don't work in the way we think. The path to happiness just simply isn't stuff. In fact, there's one correlation I share with my students that the more you self-report being a materialist person, I value what I own, I really feel like I need to have nice stuff and so on, the less likely you are to be fully mentally well-adjusted, the more likely you are to be depressed and anxious and so on. So this sort of seeking out of material goods actually is hurting your happiness, not making it better. And since I'm sure, some of the folks on the platform are students or people who are going back to school, I think academic accolades are another one that I see a ton, right? I need the perfect grades. I need to get into the perfect college. And it turns out that stuff also just doesn't predict happiness. If anything, a student's college GPA seems to be correlated with lower levels of well-being, lower levels of self-esteem, and lower levels of optimism, right? So it's kind of just not the way we think. So all the standard stuff you tick off, stuff we think of as the bottom line, like more money, more fame, more accolades, more promotions, getting into a better school, whatever it is, that stuff just doesn't work in the way we think.
Is that because there's always something else to achieve after you achieve that thing?
Yeah, it's in part for two reasons, right? One is that there is always that next carrot, right? And this is something I share with my Yale students. I talk about this, this bias, which in science we call the arrival fallacy, right? I'll be happy when I get into the perfect school. I'll be happy when I make $1 million, whatever it is. I'll be happy when my startup, gets really successful, gets bought, whatever. I show this to my students by pulling up the videos that they post on YouTube of the moment they found out they got into Yale. There's this thing called like acceptance videos where it's like you click on the link, you're like, you got into Yale. And they're like, oh my God. And they freak out. And so I play these videos, which hits my students, right? These are students who, when they were in high school, really wanted to go to Ivy League school. They found out they got in. All my students self-report the same thing. They're like, that moment when I clicked on it was great. But like the next second I took a breath was like, it's the medical school, or I got to get a Rhodes Scholarship, or I got to found the perfect startup, or whatever it is. It's like, there's always that next dangling carrot, and we don't even take time to, enjoy the carrot we just got, let alone the ride and the journey on the way. And so I think that's one reason why these moments of arrival don't feel as good as there's the next thing. I think a second reason is, even if there's not the next thing, let's pick like getting married. If I find the perfect partner, I'm going to be happy, right? We're probably not going to, hopefully not going through extremes of new partners over and over again, right? We want to pick the right one and just have that one forever. But what happens is you just get used to that person. You marry the person and, it's a new wedding, new spouse. And it's like, that's just your spouse, right? You just kind of get used to it. And this is a phenomenon that researchers call hedonic adaptation. We just kind of get used to the good stuff out there, to the point that the best thing in life, the thing that you most want to happen, could happen, and it could stick around. The pleasure of that thing could stick around, but like the experience of that thing won't stick around. Like you think about the best things, and I don't know if you guys are parents, but the example I often use is like, the first time your kid said mommy or daddy, right? Like that's like amazing. But, time number 300,042 that they just said it last week, it just stops, or the first time your partner said, I love you, right? That feels great. But like last Thursday when they said it, it's just not the same. And so this is hedonic adaptation in action. And it's one of the reasons the good stuff in life doesn't continue to feel good, is that we just get used to it.
This is really, in some sense, tough to hear, because our world is not set up for us to be happy. We're not wired to be happy. We often chase after things, but as soon as we achieve that, it goes away.
We don't want it anymore. Yep.
And so what you're describing is that happiness is almost a skill on its own. You need to learn how to become happy. It is not from kind of obvious things that you chase after, like money or status or, better car. It's really a skill that's inherent inside you.
That's why the research is so important here, is that you can learn, okay, what are strategies that work for feeling happier? I think this work shouldn't be taken to say, well, there's nothing you can do to feel happier.
Yeah.
There's lots of evidence that we can improve our well-being. The class I teach at Yale, what we find is on average, every student who takes the class goes up about 1 point on a 10-point happiness scale. So becoming about 10% happier. And that's what the research really shows. It's usually between 10 to 15% happier. That's how much you can kind of improve on a typical scale. It takes some work, but you got to do it the right way. You can't just go after what your intuitions are sending you after.
So your course, when people take it, they're able to raise their scale 1 additional point.
Yeah. And that, again, I think this is important, right? I think sometimes when we talk about getting happier, we think we're going like, from 0 to 100 or like, really what you're seeing are small but reliable increases over time. And those matter, right? If you're a 5 out of 10 on a happiness scale in terms of how enjoyable you find life, how satisfied you are with life, if you can go up to a 6, that feels really good. If you're a 7 out of 10 on that scale and you can go up to an 8, just through your conscious actions, through changing your thought patterns and so on, changing your sleep, like that's huge. Those changes matter a lot.
I'm not very good at seeking out happiness. I'm thankfully naturally a positive and optimistic person. But on a day-to-day, I don't think about how do I become happier? And then when I experience happiness, I'm like, oh my God, like what? Why have I not been just like putting a little more intention to enjoying this? I'm curious to get your thoughts on, is happiness something you should strive for?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the problem is that you should strive for it. I think a flourishing life, a good life, well lived, is one that's happy. And that kind of raises in some ways a definition of happiness. How do we think about happiness? And I usually define it as sort of being happy in your life and with your life. And so this is sort of what researchers call the kind of affective and the cognitive parts of happiness. You feel like your life is good. That's the affective part. And you think your life is good. You're sort of satisfied with your life. You have a sense of meaning and so on. Like that's sort of what we're going for. And I think it is okay to strive for happiness, but you have to not make the mistakes. One is you have to go after the right stuff. And we just talked about the wrong stuff. I think we'll have some time to talk about the right stuff in a second. I think you also have to not think of happiness the wrong way, right? Being happy in your life and with your life often includes lots of negative emotions. To have a really good life, you have to sometimes be frustrated. It's normative to feel upset about things. It's normative to feel sad. It's often normative if you have lots of goals to feel overwhelmed and a little burnt out. Those are useful, normative, normal signals that good lives should have. But I think sometimes when we think, strive for happiness, you think, well, I can't have any of those, good vibes only, and that's not really striving for happiness. That's sort of striving for like toxic positivity, right? That's kind of going after things in ways that are ultimately harming you. And so I think it's okay to strive for happiness, but often when you do that the right way, it doesn't look like the way you think. It's not going after money. It's not banishing all your negative emotions. It's often not focusing on your happiness, because one of the easiest paths to happiness is doing something nice for somebody else, right? So it's often, if you're going to be buying things or spending money or being goal-oriented, those goals are often about other people if you're really doing it the right way. So it's not the striving that's bad. It's that we often get it wrong.
One thing I wanted to point out about what you just said is that even as a happiness expert, what you're saying is that our goal is not to maximize happiness and feel happy all the time. We want to live a good, fulfilling, well life, and happiness is a component of that. I think that's a really important point you're making here.
Yeah. And I think, that gets back to the way I think lots of the ancients talked about happiness, right? If you look back to Aristotle and the Greeks, they had this notion of eudaimonia, which is loosely translated as sort of a good life. And by that, they didn't just mean, every hedonic pleasure all the time, no negative emotions. They meant living a life that had purpose and meaning and was a life that you felt was well lived. And it's just kind of impossible to do that without any negative emotions, without any strife, without any failure. That's just kind of built into the whole deal.
That makes sense. I mean, some of my happiest moments come after some of my, lowest moments. And it's really being able to feel the difference between the two that makes me really appreciate the happy moments when I have it. Can you talk more about the people? Let's say there's people who are, heavily depressed. They're very negative. They don't have a healthy mental health. But talk more on the people who are, kind of like languishing. They're not really flourishing, but, kind of in that middle. Can you talk a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think this is why a focus on happiness is sometimes can for some people be more helpful than a focus on fixing depression, fixing anxiety, and so on, right? Like, obviously, you want to fix depression and anxiety. If you're experiencing clinical symptoms, you want to do something to fix that. But I think you can kind of not feel like you're flourishing, even if you don't necessarily qualify as being clinically depressed or clinically experiencing clinical levels of anxiousness. And I think that's this idea of kind of languishing, where you just kind of feel like you're stuck. You're not really curious about anything. You're not kind of moving forward. That's not a fun way to live life, right? It often means that you're not achieving the goals that you care about, but it often means you're not living a life that feels good to you. Again, happiness is defined as sort of being happy in your life and with your life. And I think if you're languishing, you're not experiencing lots of positive emotions. Mostly you're experiencing this negative emotion of languishing. And if you think about how your life is going, you kind of just don't feel like it's going that great, right? You feel like there's maybe something important and something missing. And so I think that emotion of languishing is a really good, honest negative emotion signal that you might need to make some changes. Maybe you need a little bit more excitement in your life. Maybe you need to get really curious about what's going on. Maybe you need to notice the kinds of things that light you up and become a little bit more mindful. There are solutions there, but languishing is really a signal that you need to take some action.
I feel like the concept of languishing has really hit us during COVID. What are some actionable steps that you would recommend?
Well, I think the first one is really just recognizing, being mindful about it, right? I think one of the problems with languishing is like, we don't have time for that. Like, it's just kind of, we're thinking, well, everything else is fine. I'm just being a baby about this, whatever. Let me just push on, like, stiff upper lip kind of thing. I think step number one is noticing, like, I'm feeling like I'm languishing. Like, I'm just not excited about stuff anymore. I just don't feel like I'm living my best self, right? And that first, that takes admitting. And I think sort of noticing what's going on, really asking yourself, like, well, what are the emotions that are there for this, right? And I think sometimes you notice, maybe I'm bored, maybe I'm frustrated, maybe I'm lonely, right? I feel like I'm languishing because I don't have the social connection that I need. I think what you often have to do with negative emotions is to really get curious and start investigating them. And often what seems like one emotion at the start, when you get a little curious and you dive deeper, you can notice what's kind of missing. Like, maybe you just don't have like something that's giving you a sense of purpose or a sense of connection, right? You can kind of figure those things out. And then once you notice what those things are, it's helpful to just start, piecing away, like, oh, like, what can I do? Baby steps to try to fix those sort of things. With languishing, a big one is often that what we need to do is to get curious and to get back to the kinds of things that we found fun before, even if they're really silly things. Just start noticing. You have to start to think. You have to start to notice fun stuff, notice the ideas you have, get a little curious about something. That's often the way we sort of break out of it. If you're really kind of feeling stuck, just really, put your attention on to anything that you get a little mild curiosity about. That just a Netflix series, like, oh, that seems kind of cool. Like, it doesn't have to, really try, like, or that's a question I have, something I'm a little curious about. I want to know more about that. Those are the little seeds of how you break out of the doldrums and languishing, as you notice those and just find ways to follow up on them so you can give them more of your time and energy.
This is so important because sometimes languishing, I feel, can be even more dangerous than just knowing that you have, bad mental health or struggles, because you tend to just ignore it.
Yeah.
And
I'm doing fine at work, like I'm taking care of my kids. It's not that bad, right?
Yeah.
You can just get stuck for a while.
Yeah. And, even for me, when I'm feeling those kinds of thoughts, oh, I'm doing fine at work, or I'm doing fine in my relationship, or I'm doing fine here, I tend to notice that I'm not as happy as I could be.
Yeah. And I think this is a thing to remember, a good life isn't just the absence of all this bad stuff. It's not the absence of panic attacks or the absence of, kind of experiencing really terrible depression. It's supposed to feel like something positive, and so if you don't have those positive emotions, that's a thing to sort of think about too. And I think that's a way to get out of languishing too, right? Is to think about what are some spots where I can build in more positive emotions, things like humor. A positive emotion, I think, that we often forget is awe, right? The sense that there's something bigger than ourselves, something that kind of is curious to us and we want to sort of learn more about. One of the reasons that folks often talk about breaking out of languishing by just getting out in nature for a little bit, to see the sunshine, get into nature. I think those are moments where we're experiencing a little bit more awe, and that positive emotion alone can kind of break us out of a bad spell.
I feel like one difficult thing about languishing is also that even if you know you're languishing, you don't see the point of getting out of it. Like you're doing well. You're, let's say, killing it at work. You're making a lot of money. Is it important to try to get out of languishing? Like, is happiness actually important? Should we actually be more intentional about seeking out happiness? And what are some effects of that?
Yeah, well, there's lots of work showing that experiencing positive mood, and I think that would be the opposite of languishing, which doesn't feel so hot, just has a whole host of positive consequences. It has positive consequences for our bodies. We wind up with less inflammation. We wind up recovering from diseases faster. One of my favorite studies that I share with my undergraduates was kind of mean studies where they bring people into the lab and they shoot their nose up with a little syringe that has rhinoviruses, which are the viruses that cause the common cold. So they're basically exposing everybody like we are on like these trains, just like terrible colds everywhere. And the question these researchers ask is just who gets sick. And what they find is that the folks with the most positive style, which are the people who tend to be experiencing the most positive emotion, they're the ones who are least likely to get sick.
Wow.
Right? Does that mean we, get rid of masks or don't, wash our hands? No. But what it means is that like positive emotion can help. There's also lots of studies showing that positive emotion is correlated with longevity. This was a very famous study that was trying to ask the question, like, do happier people live longer? Which is tricky because there's so many things that affect whether or not we live longer, like, our health and the risks we're taking. And so these smart researchers said, well, to answer this question, what we have to do is to find a population that's like really constrained, that lives kind of the same lives, and ideally like lives that are like not that risky, like not like motorcycling or smoking lots of cigarettes or whatever. And so what they did was they found a population of nuns, like Catholic nuns. And what they measured was whether or not these nuns had a positive style, lots of positive emotion early in their life. I guess nuns do these journaling projects really early on when they become nuns, and they just, machine learning analyze the number of positive words in there. And then they use that to predict how long these nuns lived. And what they find is that the nuns who expressed the most positive emotions in their 20s were the ones that were more likely to live into their 80s and the ones that were more likely to live into their 90s, hinting that, positive emotion like allows us to like live longer. Also allows us to do better things in the world. There's a phenomenon known as the feel good, do good effect, which is that like if you're in a good mood, you wind up doing nicer stuff for others. Whether that nicer stuff is like, volunteering for some experimenter who's asked you to do some like, long drudgery type task, helping someone find a lost contact. I think this is a funny study in the 1970s where someone's like, I've lost a contact, who will help me find it? And people who were in the good mood did that more often. But there's also evidence that people who are in good moods are the ones who are out solving the big problems of the world. This is some lovely work by Konstantin Kushlev at Georgetown, where he looks at, if you're worried about, say, climate change, like who are the folks who are going out to like fight climate change, going to protest, getting people to put solar panels on and so on. And he finds that it tends to not be the people who are the most anxious about climate change. It tends to be the people who experience the most positive emotion generally in their lives. They're the ones that have the bandwidth to do this stuff. Wow. And again, we kind of know this, right? If you're languishing, you're not like out on the front line fighting for whatever cause you care about, right? You're not checking in on your friends as much. You just like don't have, you don't have the emotional bandwidth to do that, right? But if you're feeling happier, if you're feeling more positive emotion, now you're doing more for others, you're feeling better physically, your bodies are feeling better, you're thinking more innovatively. Like all in all, you want to get out of that languishing state because positive emotion has positive consequences for you and your performance and the people around you.
What are the factors that lead to languishing?
I think oftentimes we wind up in a rut with our behaviors, right? Sometimes when people are languishing, you really stopped, first of all, often you have too much on your plate, right? So you wind up languishing because you just like, it's another version of feeling overwhelmed, which is a negative emotion that I worry about in my own life a lot because I'm very prone to that, right? Sometimes it's because the ratio of the fun stuff has gone away. Sometimes it's because you're not socially connecting with others as well. Sometimes you didn't do anything wrong. It's just, again, negative emotions are just part of being human. And these are the things that can creep up. Sometimes it's external circumstances, right? It's easier. You mentioned that a lot of us were experiencing languishing in COVID. And that was in part because we changed our behavior. We weren't going out and doing as much fun stuff. Maybe we weren't seeing as many people. It was also just a tough time in the world, right? And so that can kind of creep up. And so I think like with many negative emotions, there are internal factors, there are situational factors, but there's lots of things that we can do to make it better or worse too.
Oh, that's so powerful because a lot of times I feel guilty when I seek happiness. I'm not working hard
Mm-hmm.
enough, or like, why do I deserve this? Let's work harder and, help other people more. But what you're saying is seeking happiness for yourself could be the fuel to help other people, that natural fuel. It helps me live longer, perform
Mm-hmm.
better. And so it is almost my duty to seek happiness in my life.
Yeah, I think this is a really freeing perspective for a lot of people because I think you're not alone. A lot of people think, I have all these other privileges. Why should I focus on my own happiness? Or even worse, I think there's a lot of people who look out at just like, a lot of the bad stuff that's happening in the world right now. Pick your favorite bad thing that's happening, right? And you think like, well, I couldn't possibly be happy in the face of that, right? That would be kind of condoning the thing, or in some sense, we think that like our frustration and our negative emotions are the like juice to solve those problems, right? And those things have their place, right? I think, anger, for example, often comes up in the face of violations of social justice for ourselves or people in the world that we want to fix, right? Sadness is often a sign that there's something wrong that we'll want to fix, right? But to fix it, you got to have the emotional bandwidth to do that. And I think if you're not giving yourself the kind of happiness self-care that you need, if you're not giving yourself some positive emotions, if you're just kind of stuck in languishing, like you're not going to have the wherewithal to do that. And so I think sometimes it's helpful to remember like, oh, if I want to perform well, even if I just want to be a good person, like focusing on my own self-care and making sure I'm not languishing can be really important.
When is it good to like keep pushing, even though you're in a stress negative state, just keep pushing, keep maybe out of fear, out of whatever it might be, versus like when do we kind of take a step back and hey, let's rewire our brain to be more positive and then go from
Yeah.
there.
I think the answer to that question starts with noticing where you are, right? Which is so inconvenient when we're in that overwhelmed state and we're pushing. Often, if you pay attention, I often joke that it's like a little Spidey sense that comes out of like, I'm not loving this anymore. Like, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. Like, I need a break. Like, I'm on my last nerve. That's often a very inconvenient thing to notice. But if we have a moment, often it like, you see it, I'm loading the dishwasher and I'm like slamming things around and like, I'll be like, Laurie, like, you're having a tough time right now, right? That little moment is a cue that often what you need is some self-compassion. And self-compassion is based on the lovely work of Kristen Neff at UT Austin. It kind of has these three parts. Part one was what we were just talking about, that sort of mindfulness of like, actually, I'm struggling right now. I'm not having a good time right now. I'm stressed right now. I'm worried about failure. I feel like I'm butting my head against the wall. Whatever it is, you mindfully notice things are not great, right? It's not good. The second thing, though, you do, the next step is what she calls common humanity. And then you say, and this is normal. It's normal to go through this. It's normal to be stressed. Like the world is a mess. I'm not alone. It's a common human experience to experience what I'm experiencing. And then step 3 of self-compassion, mindfulness, common humanity. And then it's what Kristen Neff calls self-kindness. You say, what do I need right now? What can I take off my plate? Like, what's the right move here? You talk to yourself like you would talk to a friend. And I think self-compassion is powerful because it gets at the question you were just asking, which is like, when do you keep pushing? When do you ease off? Like what do you need, right? And I think we often get better answers to that question if we're thinking about a friend. Like we can sometimes be with a friend that's being a little self-indulgent and like, yo, you could push yourself a little more, right? We wouldn't say that to them in a mean way. We might just get curious of like, what's going on? Like, why aren't you doing more? Like, what's happening? We want to problem solve. Okay, what can we do to push ourselves a little more, right? You wouldn't do it in a mean way. You wouldn't do it in an overbearing way. You would watch for signs of overwhelm and stuff. You just be curious and problem solving and like mentory. That's the energy we need to bring to ourselves. And we need to bring it to ourselves because it's not self-indulgent, right? If your friend was really screwing up, you wouldn't just let them keep really screwing up, but you'd be nice about it, right? You'd try to figure out what was going on. And that's, I think, what we need. Like with our friend, we kind of know the difference between like, you should keep pushing or like, you need to ease off, like you need a break, right? We often can see that more quickly for a friend than ourselves. But when we bring this lens of self-kindness to ourselves, we can sometimes notice it more. And sometimes you'll notice that like, no, this is a hard time right now, but I've got the wherewithal. I can keep pushing. And sometimes you're like, I'm just going to implode if I keep pushing. Like, I just need a break. I just need some time off. I need to take something off my plate. That's the sort of approach. So you got to notice like, ooh, there's a Spidey sense of like, there's a question there of, do I keep pushing? And then you say, okay, it makes sense. I'm not going to beat myself up over this. Common human experience. What do I need right now? And usually that attitude gets you to the right spot.
What about for the people who have been through so much trauma or hardship? Like, what's a healing mindset shift that can really help them open the door to joy?
Yeah, well, I'm glad we just brought up self-compassion because there's actually some research on the power of self-compassion for helping in cases of trauma. Kristen Neff does this work with Afghani and Iraqi veterans who've been through combat, one of the easiest spots to develop, to experience trauma and develop things like post-traumatic stress disorder and so on. And she finds that training with this practice of self-compassion, again, mindfulness, common humanity, self-kindness, it actually reduces rates of PTSD in these soldiers who've experienced the same level of combat, but the ones who bring more self-kindness and more self-compassion wind up kind of not experiencing the negative effects of trauma in the same way. And so I think that's one starting point, is to notice, like, I'm struggling right now. That was a terrible experience. I just went through a lot, right? But anyone who just went through what I went through is going to experience this stuff. I'm not alone. This is a normal reaction. Like, if my fight or flight system's activated, whatever it is, that's just like my body's way of trying to help me. Normal, normative, common human reactions to this stuff. What do I need right now? What can I take off my plate? What boundary do I need to set, right? Those are the kinds of questions you ask. So I think that the beauty of self-compassion is it's useful in our garden variety, stuff that made me overwhelmed situation. But it's also useful for like the really tough stuff, right? You have to kind of allow and recognize those negative emotions and where you are to ultimately get to joy down the line.
What gets in the way of self-compassion? I know for me, it's so much easier for me to be compassionate towards other people than myself.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think that's one reason, right? Is that like we're so much more naturally able to extend compassion to other people than ourselves. To ourselves, we extend self-criticism, push, like the drill instructor mindset.
So mean.
I often joke that if HR could hear the way we talk to ourselves in our head, we'd get fired because we would never, hopefully never talk to a coworker like that, right? And I think it's not because we're evil. I think we have a certain theory of motivation that like if we just kind of scream at ourselves or we push, that's the way to perform. I think it's not because we're masochists. I think it's because we're motivated. It's like we're like kind of internal capitalists, as it were. We just like want, like to push as hard as possible. But the research shows that that's just an incorrect theory of motivation. We'll do much better. We'll procrastinate less. We'll perform better if we can just be a little bit nicer to ourselves. It kind of just doesn't work the way we think. So I think we have to get out of the mindset of like, this is what I have to do to perform better. And often that means kind of breaking out of a little bit of perfectionism. That kind of self-critical, anti-self-compassionate mindset tends to go with a sort of perfectionist streak, like I'm supposed to be perfect, I'm never supposed to take a break, and those are kind of thought patterns that's worth sort of renegotiating as well.
For the overachievers listening right now, I know that for me, when I think about happiness versus ambition, they sometimes are battling each other. I want to be really ambitious. If I'm too happy and too lax, maybe my ambition will, drop a little bit. What do you say to people who are experiencing that battle?
The thing you're saying is sort of a hypothesis, right? Like if I'm too happy, then I won't be ambitious. I won't achieve as much, right? So let's just look at the data. Who's out there coming up with the innovative solutions? Who's out there kind of following through on their ambition plans, not procrastinating? Is it the people who are incredibly self-critical and beating themselves up and being perfectionistic? Or is it the people who recognize that a little bit of balance and self-care needs to be part of the mix? And the data fall down heavily on the latter side.
Really? Wow.
You look at, individuals who, give somebody a problem where they have to come up with an innovative solution. What you find is the people who come up with the most innovative solutions are the ones who are experiencing the most positive emotion. You give somebody a problem where it's just like a really hard thing to do and it'd be easy to procrastinate. Who are the folks who are pushing through, not procrastinating? They're the ones who are giving themselves the most self-kindness. I think we get this idea of sort of work-life balance wrong. I actually kind of hate this term because it feels like when you talk about work-life balance, it's like, well, there's work and there's ambition and all this stuff. And then there's life, there's happiness. It's like you have to go down on one to go up in the other, right? I just think the research just says that that's not the right metaphor. A better metaphor is work-life harmony, where if we're promoting our positive emotion, we're taking care of ourselves, we're noticing our level of overwhelm. Ultimately, what that does is cause us to work harder, more effectively, more accurately. We wind up performing better when we take care of our mental health.
Yeah, if work could be just not something you do for money or status, but something you feel called to, something you truly enjoy. And it might be still challenging. It might be really challenging, in fact. Once you have that alignment with your life and your own vision, it just becomes so much easier. Like challenges become, something to overcome instead of something that's blocking you from getting to where you want to get to.
Yeah, and I think it also reminds us that like we can start to notice when those ambitions are a right fit with our goals and our values too, right? Sometimes the overwhelm is just, there's just too much on your plate. Everything's aligned well. It's just like you put too much on. And the right thing to do is to take some stuff off the plate. That's what you're going to do to achieve and not burn out, right? But sometimes that overwhelm, that languishing is a sign that we're not really aligned the right way, that the things we're going for, no longer fit what we want to be doing, like they're no longer the right balance. And I think that sometimes can be a moment to ask yourself, is this really fulfilling my purpose? Am I getting meaning out of this stuff? Is the alignment correct for me right now? And sometimes that kind of conversation can be really helpful because then you're putting your time and your work into something that really feels like a calling that's giving you purpose as opposed to just doing the work for the work.
Yeah. One thing that stuck out to me was your advice to look at negative emotions with curiosity. What is the purpose of negative emotions? And including curiosity, what can we do to overcome them?
This is a very salient question for me today because just before this interview, I had to take my car in. I had an engine light and my car came on. I was like, oh God, what's wrong with it now? And, and so that's my frustration. Like, oh God, what's wrong with the car now? But really, if I probe a little deeper, I do two things. One is I have some gratitude. I'm like, okay, thank you. And, engine light to come on. Turns out I brought it in. It was something wrong with some brake thing. I don't know anything about cars, but it was a thing that was good to get fixed because I could have gotten hurt if I just let this go. Right. So, oh my gosh, gratitude. Thank you, engine light, for alerting me to this thing that I didn't otherwise see, but really required some attention. Right. And then also curiosity, right? It's not just the engine light. It's like, what's going on? Like, what happened to the car? Why is, it's the brakes. Like, well, what happened to the brakes, right? You kind of try to understand what's happening, right? That's our car. It's easier, but it's a nice kind of metaphor for what's going on with our emotional system, right? You're just going through life and you feel really anxious or you feel kind of lonely. You feel that moment of overwhelm, right? That's in some sense your car's your internal mind's car's dashboard telling you something important, right? That feeling of anxiety is showing you that something's up, right? There's a threat out there that you need to detect and fix. A feeling of loneliness is showing you you're missing some social connection. Overwhelm is saying there's too much on your plate, right? These are useful signals that are honest signals about something that's going on that requires your attention that you could ignore, just like the engine light. You could be like, well, I don't feel like dealing with that right now. But then, your emotional system is going to break down on the proverbial highway at some point, right? And so just like with my engine light, we can react with the same two things. We can say, let me be grateful for this. Thank you, overwhelm, for giving me thank you, pissed offness, for having me scream at the car in traffic to realize it's not about the car. It's about I gotta ease up on my calendar, or I gotta ask my husband for some help, or thank you for giving me the signal so I could fix it, right? So kind of gratitude is number one emotion. Wow. But the second emotion is exactly what you said. It's curiosity. It's what is going on? Often that first emotion we get is sort of like engine light. I mean, maybe I have a very old car, so maybe now the top cars are brakes or tires. They're just mud, but mine's just I don't know, it's just something, right? And I feel sometimes our negative emotions are like that. I'm just Arr! And I look in, I'm I haven't hung out with a friend in 2 weeks, right? I just need to get some social connection. Just way too much on my plate. Or just I just spent the last 3 nights just doom scrolling through all the terrible stuff that's happening in the world. And maybe that I just need, something that's feeling a little bit lighter right now, just some humor in my life, right? You kind of have to look at it and get curious about it to dig deep enough to notice what the problem is. And when you do that, you often come to the solution. But you don't get there if you ignore the emotion, put on blinders. You definitely don't get there if you suppress your emotions, just not feeling this right now, going to squish that down. you really got to sit with it. You got to kind of go to the mechanic, as it were, and really just kind of look at what's going on. But the act of doing that almost always is the best way to lead to a solution. Usually we're so scared of our negative emotions, and it's fair. They don't feel good. They feel pretty crappy. But often our fear of it is that this emotion, if we really look at it, it's never going to go away, or we're going to be trapped. We're experiencing sadness, we're going to feel sad forever. Experiencing anxiety, we're going to feel anxious forever. But clinical psychologists will tell you that emotions are like a wave. When you really sit with that sadness, that anxiety, when you allow it non-judgmentally to be there, often it takes its course in like 7 to 10 minutes. Like, it's not going to stick around forever. It's not going to drown you. The problem is we never take time to do that. But most of our emotions, cravings, urges, they're like a wave. If you're in clinical practice, folks often talk about urge surfing, where you sit with that craving of that urge and it feels bad for a while, but then, it takes its course. Emotions are like that too.
I love how this can be applied to both, positive emotions as well as negative emotions, because it makes each emotion less daunting.
Yeah.
Because as you know, it's going to be going away, shortly after.
Yeah. And so it's like you can kind of sit with it. I remember, honestly, when I first got into the happiness science, learning this, and I'd be like, I don't think my sadness is just going to be 7 minutes. I really don't. And obviously there's, deep grief and there's trauma and these things. But oftentimes if you sit with something that feels really bad, it does dissipate. Yeah. It does get better if you just sit with it. We just never give it the time. I remember I was having a situation a few years ago. I was having a big fight with a friend, and I was really upset about what's going on. I was like, let me just sit with this emotion. I use a practice that I teach my students that's called RAIN. It's a meditation practice popularized by the meditation teacher Tara Brach. And the acronym for RAIN is recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. So it's recognize, what? Something's going on. I'm really sad. I'm feeling really betrayed. I'm feeling really lonely. Just let me just sit with that. And you sit with it and you're like, oh my God, this is hurting my chest. I feel like I want to cry. I feel it in my cheeks and whatever. But the longer you just sit with it, your brain can't just sit and focus and notice for that long. So then I start thinking well, what am I going to have for dinner? And then you realize oh wait, actually I'm not feeling it as profoundly as I was before. It's kind of gone away, right? You can kind of be back to the present moment. And so it's a practice that I was shocked at how effective it was when I was in the thick of pretty bad emotions, and one I recommend a lot. And it's also one that can kind of build on itself, because once you do it once, you're like, oh my God, that thing that I thought was so scary wasn't as bad as I thought. Now I know how to do it a little bit better again, right? Again, the car analogies. The first time I take it to the mechanic, I got to figure out the number. I got to call. It's weird. But then the next time the tire light comes on, I know what to do, right? I just have this sort of strategy I can go to. And I think finding good ways to regulate your emotions works like that.
Becomes easier and easier the more you do it.
Yeah. You get kind of used to it. And you kind of develop a certain confidence in yourself of this emotion is not going to destroy me if I look at it.
What would you say to someone who feels broken because they can't be happy no matter how hard they try?
Yeah. I think, first I would say you're not alone, right? This is a common human experience. I bet when you said that, I don't know how many listeners listen to this right now, but a lot of them, a decent percentage of them were like, yeah, I've been there. I know I've been there, right? I think it just first recognize it's just a common human experience. All lives are going to have moments that you experience despair. You just experience extreme sadness. If you're feeling languishing, you're just not going to get there, right? That alone just gives you a breath of it's not just me, right? The second thing I would say is that there are things you could do to make it better. You're not going to go from 0 to 100 in 2 minutes. It's just not how happiness works. But there's simple behaviors, thought pattern changes, emotion regulation strategies you can use to move the needle a little bit. And when you move the needle a little bit, that helps. When you do that once, then you do it again, and you do it again. All the studies show that there's things we can do to move the needle and feel a little happier.
I would love to dive deep into the strategies and the actionable ideas.
Very influenced by cognitive behavioral therapy. And so I steal that framework, which is often called the cognitive triad, right? So it's changing your behavior, changing your thought patterns, and changing your emotions. So let's look at behaviors, right? Big one is just social connection, right? Just talk to someone. Sharing, misery often goes away when we can kind of connect with other people, right? And we often kind of don't want to connect with other people when we need it the most, right? When we're struggling the most or languishing the most. But talk to a barista at a coffee shop, text a friend and ask how they're doing, right? Try to help someone, try to engage in just some sort of pro-social action for someone else. All of these things are just enormously quick hacks to just get a little bit of more positive emotion, to get a bit more purpose in life. So social connection is my go-to when I notice I'm feeling languishing for sure. Another one is like finding ways to hack your body, right? So just a little bit of movement, ideally movement with other people outside, so you can get the awe, get the sense of nature
Two birds, one
around
stone.
you. Yeah, exactly. But it's like such a simple hack to just start moving your body a little bit and you'll just start feeling better. It's just incredible, right? Same thing with sleep. I know this is something that you prioritize a lot at Aura, right? Just getting some good sleep hygiene in so that you're not looking at your phone before you go to bed, that you kind of get everything cool and nice. Like those kind of hacks are just so powerful for just feeling a little bit better, right? So those are just some like fast behaviors that you can use to feel happier. I think thought pattern changes are ones that we've talked about a bunch. Self-compassion is a big one, right? Just work on how you talk to yourself and talk to yourself in a slightly nicer way. Get to that moment of gratitude where you're grateful, not just for your negative emotions, but all kinds of things. We're having this conversation where I am in the Northeast where like it's just starting to become spring outside. There's just like the miracle of little, buds and grasses that are like little green things that are poking up in the grass, like little fists in the air saying like spring, like there's just things to notice and feel grateful for and just kind of savor. One of the practices I like to tell my students about, because sometimes gratitude can feel heavy, like I'm thankful for this thing. And if you're not in a great place, like that can be hard to find. Instead of finding things you're grateful for, find what I like to call delights. In the midst of like the end of winter, there's little grass poking up, like, boom, I'm going for it, right? Or just like morning coffee, like someone blasting some like super crazy song. I was walking to work this morning and it was kind of early. It was like 7:30 or something. And somebody was just like banging out some Motley Crue and they're like old Toyota Corolla. And I was like, that is a delight. That's just great. I'm just glad that dude is rocking out, Those delights, I'm feeling happy about them. You guys are laughing. I feel like the listeners are laughing. Like it's just this momentary moving your attention away from the doom and gloom to just something that feels good. That's funny. That's a little bit delightful, a little bit absurd. And it feels nice. And that feels sometimes to me less heavy. When it's like, I'm not going to find anything I'm grateful for in this situation. Just like, okay, what can I notice that's just kind of fun and delightful? And share them. Some of my favorite kind of group chats and text threads are like little text threads where I share delights with friends, like stupid meme or like a joke or just like, so, the Motley Crue guy, just something funny that you see. And those things are nice. And so those are thought pattern changes. And the final one is these emotional changes. And I think it's exactly what we've been talking about, right? Like give your negative emotions some space. And if possible, try to find ways to get back to other positive emotions, things like joy and humor and awe. Those things matter a lot too.
Could you summarize the 3 triads just one more time for our listeners, please?
Yeah, so it's like a nice little triangle. It's changing your behaviors, changing your thought patterns, and changing your emotions. And this is kind of like CBT, kind of changing your cognitions and your behaviors and regulating your emotions.
I'm going to print it out and put it on my desk.
Yeah. My students get really sick of it because they see these triangles all the time. They think about it, yeah.
I want to dive deeper into the social component of this. You mentioned that, having social connections really helps improve your mood. Can you talk more about, so many people today feel alone, even when they're surrounded by others.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah, well, I think, loneliness is part of the human condition, right? Feeling connected with others isn't just being around other people. It's really feeling like you have a connection. And sometimes to get that connection, what you have to do is to get a little vulnerable. This is some of the lovely work of folks like Nick Epley at the University of Chicago and others finds that the way you feel connected to others is you share more, like you get vulnerable. We actually enjoy what he calls deep conversations where you're talking about things that are very vulnerable, much more than shallow conversations talking about the weather. We don't predict that, but it turns out we wind up feeling more connected. And I think this is a misconception we have about social connection too. We think, if somebody really got to know us, if we share our vulnerable sides, like people would hate us. It'd be like an overshare. They wouldn't want to connect with us. But what the research really shows is that people actually like us more when we're vulnerable. This is something that researchers have called the beautiful mess effect, that when we're like reveal our messiness, it's actually beautiful. And you can kind of see this in your own life, not necessarily somebody who's like super messy and falling apart, but like that new friend that was on the verge when they, ask you for advice or reveal something vulnerable or telling you something that they're worried about. Like, you often feel like, oh man, they feel really close to me. I feel great that I'm able to help them or able to do something, right? You don't think like, whoa, I don't want to deal with this person. You think like, oh, that I feel more connected to you now, right? We can use that vulnerability to feel connected with others, that we can open up a little bit more to kind of get that. And so sometimes the loneliness when we're around other people is like, we're just not giving ourselves the bandwidth to do that because we're too self-critical or we're too scared. But getting a little vulnerable is really the path towards more social connection. I think another problem is that we're not kind of connecting in the right way. Sometimes we have a lot of connections, but they're often not necessarily in real time. You text a friend like, whoop, and you tell them something, 5 minutes go by, whoop, you get like, our primate brains just aren't built to kind of experience that as connection as much, but talking to someone in real time, like, you and I are doing like in a sort of video chat format or on the phone, like that actually works a lot better, even if you can't. I mean, obviously, best case scenarios, you're doing that in real life, in person. And so I often tell people, pick up the phone and just call someone. We forget, we used to do that all the time. And I'm a child in the 90s. We used to do that all the time in the 90s, but we can do that now too. And that kind of in real time connection can wind up making you feel better. And so if you're feeling like, I just feel really lonely, yes, like you're just it's part of the common human experience and definitely part of the modern human experience because we've become so isolated. But the path forward is really to put yourself out there and to know that if your mind's saying like, oh, I don't want to do it, nobody cares, or I'm going to be too vulnerable, like those are all lies that your mind is telling you. The research just shows that that's the best way to feel better and to connect more is to be a little more vulnerable.
For the people listening who are introverts or socially anxious, what's an easy way for someone to build more connection?
Yeah, so this is a spot where I think the research has helped me a lot because I was worried I tend to be, in some cases a little, I don't know if I'd say full hardcore introvert, but I have introverted tendencies, right? As these things are often on a spectrum. I was shocked at the research that revealed that the benefits of social connection, the positive emotion you get from social connection and so on, they're as true for introverts and for extroverts. The magnitude of the effect is the same, which I was shocked by. But now I've read like many studies that have shown this. Well, it turns out that what's different about introverts and extroverts is their prediction. If you're an extrovert, you might predict, oh, this vulnerable social connection, it's going to be a little awkward. It's not going to be what I think, right? If you're introvert, you think this vulnerable social connection is going to feel awful. It's going to be the worst. Like the scale is not low enough for me to say how terrible this is going to be, right? But when you actually engage in it, it winds up feeling better than you think, right? It's the predictions that seem to kind of lead introverts astray from what will be really beneficial to them. I think it's true that for introverts, you need some alone time. That makes a lot of sense. But for introverts, you also need some quality social time. And that doesn't need to be social time like at some huge party or like going out to like run an improv class or something extreme, right? It's just like talk to a close friend that you have on the phone for a little bit, right? Like, engage with a totally reasonable conversation with a barista at a coffee shop, right? It's not kind of putting yourself out there in these extreme ways that cause anxiety. It's just making sure you have the normal human connection with others and your alone time at the same time. But that seems to be a recipe for much more positive emotion. There's also lots of evidence that those personality traits aren't set in stone. This is something that I think the research is changing about. We used to believe personality characteristics were kind of, that was your personality. It was just the way you were built to be. But now lots of research by folks like Sonia Lyubomirsky and colleagues are finding that we can change our personality traits around, whether that's things like our conscientiousness, but also our level of introversion and extroversion. If you just try to become a little bit more extroverted, try to be a little bit more open, reach out to people, you wind up seeming more extroverted. You wind up making it easier for yourself to connect with people.
Yeah. In our modern world today, like so many traumas, so many different things that happen to us, I think change our personality temporarily. And then we believe that's who we are. And there's a period where I thought I was like a completely introvert as well. And then as I healed more, I'm like, no, I actually love people. I want to spend more time with them.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite interviews for my podcast, although it's a podcast episode of the Happiness Lab that got the most hate, in
Oh,
fact,
wow.
was an interview I did with this woman, Jessica Pan, who had this book called Sorry, I'm Late, I Didn't Want to Come, An Introvert's Guide to Extroverting. And so she was this like incredibly hardcore introvert. She talked about like, someone throwing her a surprise birthday party and she just like cried and went in the fetal position. Everyone had to leave. Like she was just
no.
hardcore. But was realizing based on all these studies that was limiting her happiness. And so she spent a year, in the way journalists do in these book forums of like doing every extroverted thing she could, from talking to strangers to like, actually she did do improv comedy and go to these extreme networking events and things like that. And what's amazing about this story is that it worked. Like she wound up meeting more people, feeling much more connected, feeling way less lonely. And it wasn't as bad as she thought. And that was kind of why I got the hate mail, is I got a lot of introverts being like, well, that might be fine for her, but not for me. And I was like, dude, she was like really hardcore with this. And so I think we have to have the experience ourselves of changing and noticing what that feels like, in some ways to just even believe it's possible for ourselves.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about you, Laurie.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's a bit of pressure as a happiness expert to feel happy as well, but just really curious, like how's your own happiness and what are some challenges that you face?
Yeah, well, this stuff, definitely doesn't come natural to me. I think, it's definitely like a physician heal thyself sort of situation. I think since I've been teaching about these topics, doing my podcast, all this stuff, I've definitely been much happier. I'm a nerd, so I take these like 10-point happiness scales a lot, right? And overall, I would say that my happiness has gone up about a point since I've started teaching this stuff. And that's really, again, what these metrics show. You get like about 10% happier. That's sort of what you can expect. But that's in part because I'm putting in the work, right? I definitely have the instincts to do exactly the wrong thing. I'll have an overwhelming week and I'll be like, oh God, I just want to like plop down and watch. No, I do not want to talk to somebody. I definitely don't want to go to the gym. I definitely, but it's like, I know the things that I'm supposed to do a little bit better. And so sometimes that knowledge combined with the behavior can sort of help you a lot. But for me, it's constant work. It definitely, my tendency is towards languishing, especially when it feels like the world's on fire. My tendency is towards not getting in social connection, especially when I'm feeling overwhelmed. And my tendency, being a person of ambition, is to like put way too much stuff on my plate and just get overwhelmed and burned out really easily. And so, I've had to kind of work to check these tendencies. I think for me, noticing those little emotions when they come up are useful, and kind of developing this gratitude for my negative emotions of like, oh, I'm snappy, right? I'm just like working on a podcast. I'm like snappy with my lead producer right now. What's going on? Notice, that's engine light. Okay, what's happening? Too much on my plate, or it's actually about this other conversation I had. Like those tools have been so valuable to me, right? And when the bad stuff comes up, knowing like I have some agency and there are tools I can use to hack this stuff, it's been so useful.
So even as a happiness expert, it's not that you don't experience, less negative emotion. You just have the tools.
There are these natural differences in people's happiness. So there's evidence that, for example, happiness, mental health, depression, anxiety, these things are heritable, meaning at least some of the variance in the population is explained by your genetics. My genetics isn't necessarily some that's leaving me towards happiness. I think I come from a long line of languishers and highly emotional people, and it wouldn't be my natural tendency. But I've got the tools to do it better. And I think, this is something that we see with all kinds of the things we have variants for. Like some of us are naturally going to be much more fit than others. Some of us are going to have to, pay attention to and watch what we eat, right? Some of us are going to naturally be, skilled in the classroom where it's easy for us. Some of us are going to have to study a little bit more and push ourselves in different ways, right? With so many things that we want to achieve in life, we know that there's variance and some of us need to put a little bit more work in. And I think that this is the way I like to think about happiness, is that it's there for all of us. But for most of us, it's going to take some work.
Yeah, and regardless of whether you identify as a happy person or not, these tools are something that could really just help transform anyone's life. Even if you're constantly happy, if you do get curious about things, there's so much you can learn from and grow towards as well.
Yeah. And I think the people who are naturally happy are happy because they kind of tend to use these tools spontaneously,
yeah.
right? The people who you notice are happy, I think they're probably the people that are naturally noticing the things that make them grateful as opposed to the hassles in life. They're probably the people who are naturally like not shying away from their negative emotions, but giving them a little space, but regulating them, really not incubating in them, right? I think that people who are genetically predisposed to be a little happier than others are the ones who find these hacks easier, but they're still available for all of us.
I want to ask a fun question. Is there a way to go up in the scale by 2 points or 3 points from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, there's variance there too, right? I mean, we do find people, so many letters from people who are, really experiencing things like clinical depression and anxiety, suicidality, for example, when they first took some of my courses or listened to the podcast and say they've totally come around. Those people tend to be the ones that put in a lot of the work, right? And again, it's just like with all kinds of changes. Like you want to learn the violin. If I put some time to learn the violin, I'm going to get a little bit better. I'm not going to be, yo-yo ma or whatever. Yo-yo ma violin. Anyway, but the point is like, I'm not going to get so extreme, right? But there's some people who do have that tendency, who put in that much work and really try it. And so I think it's up to you. I think the key is that you got to recognize it's going to take some effort, like all good things in life. But you get better at it as you do it more often. These hacks come more naturally. I will say I still have to put effort into it myself, but I kind of know the tools more often. And I think if you're, part of a community like this, you can help each other with the tools. And that's been a great thing for me is like, I have my students around me. I have the team that helps me produce my podcast around me. They've all heard these hacks and these tools too. And so, we can remind each other of these tools, sometimes in ways that aren't as fun. Sometimes I'll, I'll be complaining about something and my lead producer will text me like, I heard there's a podcast about this that I heard. It's like, oh yeah, okay. Yeah, you're right. I'm not preacher heal thyself. Yeah.
So I want to do a quick recap for the people listening. As we grow up, so many of us chase after money, success, material things. But what you're saying is, we should rather spend that energy on connecting with other people, really focusing on noticing and facing our emotions and moving our bodies and, changing our thought patterns and, injecting more delight in our lives. Is there anything else that, we should be thinking about? Like what other things we can expand our energy into?
Yeah, that was a great summary. I mean, I think the only other one I think would be worth. Yeah, I know it's AI generated in real time. It's very good. But no, I think the only other one I would add in is that you also have to find ways to do meaningful work too. And I think sort of thinking about a life with purpose and sort of finding ways to achieve your values is really important. I think we brought this up a little bit, but the idea is that, if your work can be a source of fun, can be a source of flow, this sort of state that you're in, where you're sort of enjoying things and feeling in the zone, that matters a lot. So much of it, so many of the people listening, you have to put food on the table and a roof over your head. So you got to spend some time at work. If you can make sure work is a time that gives you happiness, either through the social connections that you get at work or the sense of meaning and purpose that you get at work, all the better. We're going to be spending, 8 hours, maybe more than 8 hours a day doing our job. How can you let your job be a source of happiness too? If you have the privilege to do that, then that can be a powerful way to improve your well-being too.
I know many of our listeners are juggling so much, kids and taking them places, work, relationship, family. And so what can they do? What can we do about parents?
Well, I mean, one very practical strategy is we just developed a really cool new resource called The Science of Wellbeing for Parents that will launch this spring. You can learn more on drlauriesantos.com/parents, but it's a whole set of conversations just like this, more specifically for parents, for what parents can do to change their behaviors, change their thought patterns, and change their emotions in ways that protect their own mental health, but are also strategies they can give to their kids to protect their kids' mental health too. Because often what parents will come to me like, oh, I'm so worried about my kids. They seem so stressed out. They seem so anxious and depressed. And then I probe a little bit and I find out it's the parents who are feeling burned out and overwhelmed and anxious and stressed, right? And so finding strategies that you can use as a parent yourself to promote your positive emotion, but also strategies that now you know so you can model them well for your kids so that they learn these strategies too. It's a fabulous way to kind of increase the mental health of families, which is really needed because right now parents report depression at twice the rate of non-parents, which is just unacceptable.
Wow.
And so I think learning these strategies, not just to help your own mental health, but to help your family's mental health can be huge.
Why is that? 2 times. That is unbelievable.
I think lots of reasons, right? I mean, parenting is stressful, right? You know, and we were just talking about work and the hours we were spending at work. What you find is that these days, modern parents are spending more hours at work on average than they did 10, 20 years ago, but they're also spending more time doing childcare than they did 10 or 20 years ago. And you can't be increasing both of these at once without some time famine, some sense that like you just don't have enough free time, right? I also think that there's lots of new modern stresses of parents that are different. It's hard to figure out ways to navigate screen time, technology, the state of the world, the academic pressures that are on kids. And I think there's lots more tools to make parents feel even more guilty. You know, as part of some of these conversations about parents, I interviewed the former Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, and he did a big kind of public health announcement when he was in office about parent stress and parent mental health, where he said, like, basically parenting is like a public health crisis because parents are so stressed out. And the thing that he found most in his research talking to parents, the emotion that he saw like most commonly exhibited by parents was guilt. Guilt. I'm spending too much time at work. I'm not doing enough for my kids. It's just not enough, right? The course is really about strategies we can use to help parents overcome things like depression and also things like guilt.
I feel like guilt is a emotion that's so hard to get rid of. You spend time with it and sometimes just nothing really happens. You still feel guilty.
Yeah. And I think this is where self-compassion can come in, right? Because it's like sometimes it sticks around because you still haven't allowed yourself to realize like, okay, this is a normal emotion. Everybody goes through this. Literally just the Surgeon General report for parents, like all parents are feeling guilty right now, right? It's a normative thing if you're a parent to experience this. Even just that can let you take a breath. Like, it's not just me, right? What can I do to be kind to myself, et cetera.
Any other strategies that are maybe a bit counterintuitive that are really specialized for parents?
Yeah. One that I love, which I think is really tricky for parents, is kind of treating your kids a little bit more agentively. One of the reasons parents are so stressed out and depressed is that they're putting in a lot of work for their kids. And that's in part because some parents are, doing a little overparenting, like bringing the lunch bag when kids, leave it behind, helping with homework, maybe sometimes over helping with homework, kind of really doing a little bit too much. And there's lots of strategies for kind of giving your kids a little bit more agency, which includes letting them fail sometimes. This is a strategy I find that parents are like, I don't want to scale back. I don't want to let my kid mess up. But often what you find is that's a path to giving your kids more agency. And it takes stuff off your plate so you're feeling a little less stressed out. And it's kind of raising competent kids that you don't have to keep protecting into the future. And so those are some strategies we talk about a lot in the course, a strategy that's called collaborative troubleshooting, where you don't try to solve problems for kids, but give kids enough agency that they can solve things themselves. And this includes for parents of very young kids too. But it's a way to kind of open up some more of your bandwidth as a parent, but also help your kids strive and learn for the future.
Seems like oftentimes you want to control the outcome, but what you're really doing is you're taking away agency from your kids.
For sure. And we know how that feels when someone does it to us, right? If your boss takes away your agency or your spouse tries to do something for you, you're like, no, let me do it, right? And we forget that that's like kind of our kids' motivation too. They want to be agentive. They want to do it themselves, right? Sometimes a lot of the resistance we run into with our kids, some of those frustrating conversations of like, they're not eating their dinner, they're not, going to bed when they're supposed to, is their attempt to kind of pull whatever agency they can. And so finding ways that you give kids more agency, it's a win from the perspective of learning and everything you know about learning theory, but it's also a win from everything we know about, burnout and overstress and these kinds of things too. We just need to give parents permission to do it more often.
I know when I'm a parent, I will take this course.
Excellent. Well, share it with other parents. Lots of friend parents out
I
there.
really hope you can take the foundation of your courses and just create a course for everyone eventually, maybe for entrepreneurs, maybe for immigrants, maybe for, that would do so much good
We're
for the
getting
world.
there. That's awesome. We're getting there.
One more thing I wanted to touch about with parenting is just such lack of time and being stretched thin.
Yes, we have a whole section of the course on time. I mean, one of the strategies is to just recognize the importance of time, right? And just like realize that it's a valuable resource. I think too often parents, are signing their kids up for a million things, signing themselves up for a million things to recognize maybe this is the ambition getting the best of me. Maybe my kids can have one or two less activities, right? It doesn't have to be soccer and ballet practice and extracurricular, let's just take one away, right? And the same thing for myself, right? What would it look like to take one thing away? Another strategy we talk about to kind of improve your sense of time affluence, the sense that you have a lot of free time, is to kind of spend some money to get back some time. Again, most people have at least some discretionary income. If you can spend that discretionary income to get back more time, whether that's, hiring a cleaning person, getting the vegetables pre-chopped up, like hiring the neighbor's kid to like mow your lawn, whatever it is, that savings in time, research tends to show, can actually be a big boost to your well-being, especially if it comes and allows you to get more time with your family. Easy, fast meal hacks are huge, right? Because they get you back more time when you would be spending time with your kids anyway. And so, finding these kind of using discretionary income to get back more time, spending money to get time, a really great hack to improve your time affluence.
I want to touch a little deeper on what you just mentioned, spending money to get more time back as a way of increasing your happiness levels. Can you speak a bit more on that? Because, now there's something that we should be spending money on instead of these material things.
Yeah, there are ways for money to make you happier. It's just we spend it wrong. We should spend our money on other people. We should do nice things for others. And we should spend our money not on material goods, but to get time back. This is a hack that comes from the research of Ashley Willens, who's a professor at Harvard Business School. She has this great book called Time Smart, where she goes through all these strategies. But her work has found that no matter what level of discretionary income you have, the more of it you spend to get time back, the happier you wind up being. Right. And again, one of the problems is that like money doesn't buy happiness because we're often not spending it to get time back. And if anything, often the more money people have, the more they're putting time into getting more money, right? Rather than getting time back. And so she just kind of flips that on its head. What would it look like to try to get more time back? She actually does a lot of really interesting work on money and time. She's made, I think, a really compelling argument that we often talk about wealth inequality, which obviously is something we do want to solve, in the world. But she actually argues that time inequality might be even a bigger hit on the kind of inequities we see in people's happiness, where it's not even having less money. It's the fact that, if you have less money, one thing you have to do is you have to work multiple jobs and you drive Uber at night. And it's like, you just don't have the free time. And so she's actually argued that we can solve some of the inequalities in happiness by kind of fighting these time inequalities in addition to sort of working on the wealth inequalities. But the striking thing there is that the time inequalities don't work like wealth inequalities. Sometimes the wealthiest people are the most time famished. Yeah. And so she likes to remind people who have a decent amount of discretionary income that you could actually spend that to get back more time.
This is so helpful. What about spending money on experiences? Does that count towards, like your improving your social connections?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's lots of reasons why spending, we've sometimes heard this idea that spending on experiences is better than spending on material goods. And there's tons of research on this. Experiences help in a few different ways. One is like material goods are really subject to this idea of hedonic adaptation. We just get used to stuff over time, right? You buy the new iPhone and it's good for a while, but like a week later, it's just your phone. You're totally used to it. But you spend the equivalent amount of money to go to Paris. That trip is probably not long. It's not going to stick around as long as the new iPhone. And we think that's a bad thing, a reason not to spend it on a trip. But no, it does stick around, right? We get to anticipate that trip before we take it. We're on the trip and it's really enjoyable. And we get the memories of that trip that stick around that kind of never fade in the same way our pleasure for the iPhone fades over time. There's also, as you mentioned, evidence that experiences make us happier because they tend to be really social. Like we tend to do experiences with other people. Many people, if you go on vacation, you go with someone, or even if you go by yourself, you end up talking to someone on that vacation, right? Whereas our material possessions tend not to increase our social connection too. They do this in funny ways too. There's a funny study that looks at even not if somebody doesn't experience the experience with you, but if you talk about it, so if I were to tell you about my most recent trip, I went to Austin and I had this cool, barbecue food and I got this Tex-Mex, that's an interesting conversation. But if I'm like, oh my God, I just bought these new shoes and they're really soft on the inside and I think they look really cool. Like you think I'm kind of a jerk. Like it's just like not an interesting conversation for other people. And so one of the reasons experiences are better is that they make us feel more socially connected, not just when we're in the experience with other people, but even like when we're just talking about them. So being a person of lots of experiences makes you more social. Being a person that's very materialistic kind of makes you seem like a jerk too. And so, so there's lots of reasons that spending our money on experiences is good too. Final thing to spend our money on is other people. There's evidence that like dollar for dollar, spending on somebody else just kind of makes you more happy than spending on yourself, no matter what you're spending it on. And so one of the best things we can do with our money to make ourselves happier is to actually give it away to good causes.
Wow. And is this strictly nonprofit donations, or could it be gifts? Could it be your family, a meal for your family?
It can be, pay for the coffee of the person behind you in line at the coffee shop. It can be gifts to your friends and family members. It's really that you're using the money to benefit someone that's not you. It winds up kind of in some ways making it bigger.
I love that humans are wired that way.
Yeah. It's beautiful. We didn't have to be, there's so many things about the happiness science. Like, oh my gosh, it didn't have to go that way, but we are wired that way. Just like the work-life harmony, it didn't have to go that way. That like, as work went up, your happiness goes, or if your happiness goes up, then you work more productively too. It didn't have to be like that, but it's just the way it is. So it's nice.
Yeah, these are just actionable tools that anyone can start using right away. Just buying a cup of coffee for someone else, or just spending it to make others happier, and they'll make you so much more happier too. Wow.
Yeah. And if you don't, and again, not everybody has a discretionary income. And so if you can't spend money on others, it's a quick way to spend time on somebody else. So every time I feel I'm feeling lonely, a hack I have is to just like go through my phone and text someone just in the contacts list, something nice. Hey, just happen to be thinking about you, just checking out how you are. Or just like, think of that thing we did together, just something that will make that person feel nice. Such an easy hack, totally free, makes you feel better, makes you feel less lonely.
I need to do that more.
Yeah, I'm gonna do it right now after.
yeah, it's a good one because like that, I often find myself in a position of, I'm not being mindful. My phone's in my hand. Am I going to doom scroll? Am I going to check my email? Or, oh no, wait, I have this hack that I can use that can boost my happiness. And it's the same kind of habit, phone in hand kind of habit.
Laurie, if you can leave our audience with one thing that you recommend that they do to find more happiness in their lives, what would that one thing be?
I think it would be to remember that happiness is possible. I think in this day and age where there's so much doom and gloom in the world, it can feel like this is just the way it is. I have no agency. I have no control over this stuff. I think just remembering that through your own behaviors and your own mindsets and your own emotion seeking, you can feel a little happier. That's been a game changer for me. And so that's the insight I'd love to leave folks with.
Love that.
Laurie, you're doing such incredible work. Where can people find you?
They can check out more of the work on drlauriesantos.com, especially parents. If you want to check out the new class, check out drlauriesantos.com/parents. And you can hear more on my podcast, The Happiness Lab.
Happiness Lab has been such an amazing podcast for me to listen to. And I know many people recognize it already, but thank you so much for all you do, all your research, all your free courses, all your free wisdom on your podcast. You're changing so many people's lives. And I can confidently say like how I view happiness has been truly transformed just from our conversation today. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you so much for watching. Hope that resonated with you.
If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button and leave your thoughts and comments.
Your support means the world to us and helps us bring these conversations to you for free. We read every single comment and we would love to connect with you there. So go subscribe. Until next time, love yourself, be kind to yourself,
And remember, your light is always within you.